My name is Claudia Graham. I'm the Director of Education at the West Indian Social Club of Hartford. And I'd just like to welcome everyone to this program. This is the launch of our series of discussion regarding community, civic duties and involvement. Tonight's topic is all we need to know about voting, the census, and redistricting. Our purpose here today is to engage the community and enlighten them, empower them about their value and the power of their value. Our moderator tonight is Ms. Carole Mulready. She's Hartford raised, has been serving at the League of Women's Voters for a long time. Recently president, currently she serves as chairperson of voter services. The collaborators on this initiative are the Women League of Voters, Hartford, Greater Hartford Branch, NAACP, the Blue Hills Civic Association, and the West Indian Social Club. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Carole, who will introduce our keynote speaker for tonight.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It's very nice to be with you, and a longtime educator myself. I am happy to be able to join you. So our distinguished keynote speaker is Ken Green. Ken is currently serving as the Political Action Committee Chair for the Hartford branch of NAACP. He is a former state representative, so he's very knowledgeable about the political process. His representation was for the first assembly district of Connecticut, which is Hartford. And does it cross over into Bloomfield, Ken?
Yeah.
And he is a social worker by training and career. Spent some time in education circles providing that service. So we thank you very much for being here and look forward to hearing about your experience and knowledge of redistricting, voting, absentee ballots, how the primaries are going to be affecting how people vote. And of course, August 9th is our primary date for Connecticut. Thank you. Welcome, and it is in your hands.
Again, thank you, Carole, for that introduction. Am I clear or am I too loud?
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Ken Green. I am a former state representative, lifelong resident of Hartford. I want to try to do a couple of things. One, a brief, my thoughts on the history and a brief history of voting in Connecticut, laws as it affected African Americans in Connecticut around voting, census, and then move quickly to what redistricting is, how do we get there, and then not so much in terms of talking about voting per se. I think it's really easy to talk about registering somebody to vote. We have a primary coming up, look at the candidates. And to me, that's the simplistic way of looking at voting versus voting empowerment and voting education, which is what a lot of what the League of Women Voters does. And sometimes I wish more of our local politicians would do in terms of educating us on not only just voting on an election day, but how to hold us accountable, how to develop issues, how to make sure that we follow those issues, and how does policies get developed. I will briefly ask and encourage us to have a conversation. I don't really hope that it's just not me presenting to you, because you guys are all well-versed and I think pillars and active members of our community. So I hope that we have a discussion, because I think that I want to see how we feel about what we consider local politics, what we consider state politics, and what we consider federal politics. Because a lot of people, when we look at political empowerment, we think it's just voting. I believe it's more than voting. It is about, as Carole said earlier, and I think Beverly mentioned, when you have a candidate night, it's really about presenting issues. It's really about figuring out where the candidates are on those issues. And then it's also about, after the vote, how do you hold us accountable and those elected officials to make sure that the issues that you're concerned about get developed. And so, you know, when we think about America and we think about voting, a lot of people may not know some of the history, which was that the Constitution never really talked about who has the right to vote. And a lot of people says it's our right to vote. The Constitution really never talked about the right to vote. It really left up the voting rights to states. And that was something that they said, well, we're not going to tell you on state level how you should enact and implement your process of your citizens voting. And so that's why you saw throughout history of America, different states have different rules about voting. So it was really nothing that was a federal mandate in the beginning. And a lot of people do not realize that. When voting was created by the United States in its early stages, it actually did not say that women or blacks or folks could not vote. What it talked about was who could vote. And it was a narrow uh, position as to who could vote. And originally, it was basically geared towards those who own land and own property, who were, quote, good citizens. And so for early on, especially in Connecticut, when you had free blacks who had land who could vote, the good citizen process came in. And for some reason, they found ways that they were, quote, not good citizens. And so there was no really specific announcement that African Americans could vote in, in Connecticut. It wasn't until 1876, after the 15th Amendment was created and passed in 1870, that it took 6 years later after that for the state constitution in Connecticut to allow African Americans to vote. And between the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, which allowed and codified that women could vote, that's how in the Constitution, through the amendment process, we then had the right to vote on the federal level versus state by state. We do know that even after the 15th Amendment, that a number of states used various voting laws and processes to keep people from being able to vote. When you talk about poll tax, when you talk about literacy exams, when you talk about reciting the constitutions. And so again, because the federal government did not tell states how they should let their citizens register to vote, a number of states came up with all of these strategies to prevent certain classes, certain races of people to vote. And then it took 100 years after 1870, about 95 years to 1965, with some of the federal legislation around voting rights acts and stuff like that, that we were able to, I think, secure that people had the right to vote, and all of those state strategies to prevent people from voting was being eliminated. We know today, and it's unfortunate that states today are trying to go back to restrictive voting rights and come up with other kinds of mechanisms where people cannot vote. Some of the voter ID requirements, some of the residency requirements, some of the paying fines, and some of the issues around the criminal justice to prevent people from voting. So this has always been since I think the creation of the United States, that voting and the rights of people to vote has been very difficult. So that's my brief on the history and my thoughts on that. Now, voting as it was created was based on population. And so when the Constitution, the government talked about census and talks about counting the people in your country, counting the people in the states, that was going to determine how many representatives you would have, not only on the state level, but on the federal level. And so when they first did the census and determined which states had the number of representatives, that's how we got with the census. And the American government talked about having a census every 10 years for the purpose of apportionment, basically redistricting and setting up your district for voting. And it was funny because, again, throughout the history, a lot of people hear about what they call the 3/5 of a person law, which there was a big fight in the government early on about whether or not they should count blacks as part of citizens so that you can apportion how many representatives you would have from your states. And because some of the southern states didn't allow blacks to vote, but they wanted to count them as far as citizens so that they can have more representatives, the northern and southern states agreed that they will count blacks as 3/5 of a person. So for every 500 blacks in a state, you will get counted as 300 for your apportionment for in terms of counting how many representatives you had. So even though you couldn't vote in some of the southern states as a black, you were counted as part of that census so that you can have apportionment, which throughout America's history, the southern states had the opportunity to have more representatives based on their population, including a population of citizens who they didn't count as citizens, who couldn't vote. And so it kind of gave them, for the southern states, it was quite an advantage. So that was that 3/5 law when they counted blacks, 3/5 was basically for a purpose of voting. And so that's where people hear about the 3/5. Some people may say, well, they counted African Americans as 3/5 of a person. That was for voting purposes and reapportionment. And so that's how we got to the census, the number of people, and then you apportion districts based on the number of people that you have. In Connecticut today, we have 151 state representatives and 36 state senators based on the population. And so again, each state have different rules about the number of state representatives and state senators. We know that the states, in terms of their federal representatives, are based on their population. We have 5 House of Representatives, again, because the states wanted to have representatives based on the population. And then we have 2 senators, which each state have. And those are the basics of voting and how we got there. And so in Connecticut today, I think that I would consider us pretty progressive, pretty good on terms of our ability to allow people to vote, registering to vote, access to the ballot, and access to voting. However, the turnout for people voting is not always that great. Let me just tell you a few, give you a few numbers on how we've been voting in some of the recent elections. We know that in presidential elections every 4 years, that is always the highest voting turnout that we have in the state and people coming to vote. And in 2020, 79% of registered voters in Connecticut voted. In the presidential election, 79, almost 8 out of 10 registered voters voted in the election. Now, 2 years prior to that, based on the non-presidential election, but some of the state elections, we had 65% of the registered voters vote. So we saw about a 15% reduction in voters from the off presidential election to a presidential election. So we know more people vote during presidential elections than non-presidential elections. When you talk about primaries, a primary is basically when people of the same party are contesting to be the endorsed candidate for their party. And so we have in Connecticut, we have a primary August 9th, and the entire state actually have a primary, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But let me just tell you statistically, in a primary, we had a primary, a Democratic primary and a Republican primary in 2018. It was not a presidential election. For the Republican primary in 2018, they had less than 30% of voter turnout. So less than 3 out of 10 people in the Republican primary voted. And the Democratic primary, it was the same, about 30%. So in primaries, you have less voter participation in primaries than you do in general elections. Let me tell you, in the 2018 election in Bloomfield, Connecticut, you had in the 2018 primary election in Bloomfield, Connecticut, you had a turnout of 22%. In Hartford, you had less than that. So in a primary election, when it's not in a presidential year, we get very low participation, very low turnout. A lot of people don't realize how important I think the primary elections are. A primary election is when people of the same party are trying to contest for a seat. For example, this year in Connecticut, you have a primary for the Secretary of State and you have a primary for the treasurer. You have, I know in Bloomfield, you have a primary for a register of voters. So because it's a gubernatorial, a statewide primary, more than likely you're going to have a higher voter percentage turnout because it's a statewide election in terms of the primary. So that's actually is a good thing, I think, because everybody has an opportunity to vote, Democrats and Republicans, because both parties have a primary. August 9th. So that's very important because a lot of people, a lot of the candidates, when they win the primary and become the endorsed candidate for their party, depending on the town that you're in and whether or not it's a Democrat leaning town or Republican leaning town, once you win the primary, your chances of getting elected increases. So primaries are very important. Now, what I hear a lot, and probably Carole in the League of Women Voters, and you folks may hear this a lot, is that people who register to vote decide they don't want to be a Democrat or Republican in terms of their registration. They want to be unaffiliated. What people need to realize is that if you're a registered unaffiliated voter, you cannot vote in primaries. In Connecticut, if you're an unaffiliated registered voters, you cannot vote in primaries. And so sometimes I have discussions with people on whether or not it's okay to, it's better to be in a party or not in a party. And I ask them to look at the history of their town and their voting, who's in a sense the majority party in their town that get elected, and whether or not there's primaries that happen in their town. Because if there's a history of primaries and a town is leaning Republican or Democrat, primaries could be very important in terms of electing your candidates, because unaffiliates cannot vote in the primary, and basically they vote for who has now won the primary. So their choices actually may be limited if they are a town where they see a lot of primaries, they're unaffiliated and they can't vote. So this is something I think people have to know, that if you're an unaffiliated voter, you cannot vote in a primary. We
Little,
have
just one little anecdote to add, Ken, to what you're saying about the unaffiliated voter. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that the word independent is in Connecticut a party. So if you fill out your form to register to vote and you put the word independent, that's not unaffiliated. You become part of the independent party. So there are these little nuances. They're not intended as a problem, but you know, when they were established. So it just complicates things. And you are so right about that issue with primaries, because very often the primary is the best election in the town. And those folks often are not opposed by another party in the regular election. So there comes another important part of the primary role.
So we know basically through census, which has always been happening in America, you, based on your population, you apportion how many representatives you have. And then in Connecticut, every 10 years after the census, you get a committee together, and then they would do redistricting. They would look at the districts and look at the population shifts and the population of each district and determine how many representatives we will have in Connecticut and what the district lines look like. We had a census every 10 years. 2010, we had a census. 2020, we had a census. After the census, the Connecticut General Assembly, Republican Party and Democratic Party create a small group of people to determine what the new districts may look like based on the census numbers and based on the districts. And for the past few years, Connecticut has kept 151 House members and 36 senators, but sometimes the districts in terms of the lines and who's in what districts changed. When I was a representative, I represented Blue Hills and part of Bloomfield. The current representative that I have now, all his district is in Hartford. He no longer represents Bloomfield. Bloomfield has one representative for its district, which covers most of Bloomfield and a little bit of Windsor. So you can see that every 10 years, you look at the population shifts, committees come together through the legislature. There's some states that allow the citizens to determine what their districts will look like. Connecticut doesn't do that. It's at the state capitol, you have leaders of the Republican Party and leaders of the Democratic Party work together to come up with what they think the districts should look like. They came out with those districts in 2021. And so now you will be voting in 2022 based on these new districts. This is very important for a lot of voters today in Connecticut. You need to figure out if your district has changed in any way and whether or not you're still voting in your current voting place as you did 2 years ago. Because after the census and after redistricting, some districts have changed, which may mean that maybe your voting place have changed. And Carole and I had a little discussion on this early this week, and we're hoping that if your district has changed and where you have a new voting place, that your local register of voters have notified you there's been a change in your voting polling place. We hope that the register of voters have done that. I'm really not sure as to whether or not they have done that. It's probably in the law that they should, but I can tell you that a lot of times they don't. Carole?
I did try to check this out with the Hartford Registrar of Voters for the Democratic Party. I was able to reach her. Actually, she told me, and this surprised me, Ken, that there is nothing that requires the registrars to send that notice. But the Hartford Registrar told me that they're sending out letters to everyone, even if their address or location didn't change. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of the things that come and go out of the city of Hartford for that. If anybody else has a question from our audience, just put it in the chat, unless you want to open it up readily to people asking questions.
So the registrar of voters send out the location.
Did John have a question? Is he trying to get in?
I see a question in the chat that has to do about the mention of an independent party. I don't know that this is from John, but it asks if the independent party is a party, how does it fit into the two-party system? Can you elaborate?
It's another party. It's amazing. In Connecticut, and I'm gonna see if I can get this share screen up. I'm gonna be working on it as I talk. It's amazing. In Connecticut, there are more unaffiliated voters registered as unaffiliated voters in Connecticut than there are Democratic registered voters and Republican registered voters. In fact, unaffiliated voters comprise half of the registered voters in the state of Connecticut. So on one hand, people say, well, it sounds progressive because it's unaffiliated, and that means that people think that they can choose their candidates and they're free from the influence of the party. But party politics and primaries are still strong in Connecticut. So they, in a sense, lose out from that. And in Connecticut, we have an independent party that's separate from the unaffiliated voters, as Carole was trying to explain. There's actually a group called the Independent Party, the Green Party, Working Families Party. There's a number of parties in Connecticut. But let me ask you guys this. We have about 2,500 registered voters in Connecticut. Can somebody try to give me some guesses as to, and I kind of gave you a hint, as to the number of Democratic voters in the state of Connecticut out of the 2,500,000.
2 million. You can write it in the chat if you like.
Yeah,
Take a
you can write
guess.
it in the chat. The number of Democratic voters out of the 2.5 million voters in the state of Connecticut.
1.5 million.
There's one Democrat guess, 1.5 million. Okay. Anybody else want to submit a number? Okay, so Claudette, thank you, 750,000. Site, oh, 600,000 from John. Okay. Oh, you got 3 good ones to go with, Ken. You want to tell everybody?
The number of Democratic voters registered in the state of Connecticut is 905,000 Democratic voters. So no less than 1 million. All right, very quickly, number of Republican voters.
600,000.
I heard
Okay.
600,000, 500,000. Claudette is close, 497,000 Republican voters. We have 1 million unaffiliated voters in the state of Connecticut. So if you look at the 904, you have 1.3 combined Democrats and Republicans, but you have 1 million unaffiliated voters. So the largest party, in a sense, in Connecticut is unaffiliated voters, and they're not a party.
And they're not.
And they're not a party.
So they cannot determine the candidates. That's the point, right, Ken?
They can determine a candidate because they will be considered what we call the swing vote. In the general election, since they can't vote in the primary, the unaffiliated vote is critical in the general elections because they could be the swing vote. Because if you have equal number of Democrats and Republicans, and you got twice as many unaffiliated, they can actually influence the outcome of an election. So unaffiliated voters, and this is one thing that when party politics, when they have primaries and they're just trying to get past the primary, they may not necessarily pay attention to the unaffiliated voters because they can't vote in primaries. In the general election, if you have an opponent, then you're going to be concerned about trying to get the unaffiliated voters because they can be the swing votes and they're the majority in terms of the class. But if you're a part of a party and you don't have an opponent, the unaffiliated vote may not matter at all.
We have a question from Rhonda Caldwell. Do you want to take that, Ken?
Yeah, if you can read
Her
the question.
hand is raised. She hasn't written. She'd like to speak. Rhonda, is that your choice?
Yes.
You have to unmute.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, I really actually don't have a question. I just have a kind of an observation. The two-party system, I was a treasurer down here in New Haven County, New Haven, for a couple folks, for Robin Porter and for treasurer for Darrell Brackeen Jr. And we found it to be very interesting on, about the voting, getting ballot access for candidates is very interesting. Because if you're not a part of the major party, which is obviously the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, we found out that you really can't even get grant funds unless you get signatures. If you want to be like, let's say you don't get enough signatures to force a primary, then you have to actually go get signatures to even qualify for the grant, the CEP grant. So there's a lot of things that we found out during the run for Secretary of State. Darrell Brackeen ran an exploratory for Secretary of State. And then obviously transitioned to candidate committee about how hard it is to get on a ballot, through the Democratic Party. And then, like you said, with the party politics, it's hard to get on to get the ballot access. And then once you get ballot access, if you don't get ballot access, even in like a state district, because you were a state rep, you already kind of know how much fun it is. If you don't get in through that DTC or that RTC, if you get in through a minor party, you have to go out and get signatures to even get the grant. So I tell my people down here, our experience has been very interesting because voters don't know kind of what happens behind the scenes before you even get that ballot. You know, how do those people appear on that ballot? That's why I think this teaching tonight is very good. I would love for you if you could come down and do it down in New Haven County. They have no idea how these names just appear on the ballot. And there's been a lot of things that happen to get folks there.
Thank you, Rhonda.
And,
Go
and
ahead,
Rhonda,
Ken.
Rhonda talked about CEP. That's called the Citizens Election Program. That's what they had years ago when I was in the legislature, we passed where we had the public financing of candidates. There was a thought that if we took out special interest money, if we took out private money, if we took out corporation money to fund candidates, candidates would have a better chance to run for office, and we might open up the field of candidates running for office if we had public financing to give to the candidates to run for office. I gotta admit and tell you that I'm very disappointed in the Citizens Election Program. My research has indicated to me that we have not had the kinds of contested elections that I was hoping for. I don't think we've had what I might consider a kind of a person who just had an interest in politics and wanted to run, how they might know about public finance. This is one of the things that I believe happened with the Citizens Election Program. The Democrat and Republican Party, unfortunately, wrote it, in my opinion, wrote it in a way that made it very difficult for independent candidates, minor party candidates, and new candidates and novice candidates, as Rhonda said, to be eligible for the public monies. If you had a party like a Democratic Party or Republican Party that's been doing this for years, and they know the system of who's going to donate money, and they set the rules up where they in the party actually have a system to get you to the minimum qualifications to get the funding. If you're not aware of that system, if you're not aware of how that goes, you're working behind them already. We actually have less contested offices and people running for offices on a state level than we've had 15, 20 years ago. And so the Citizens Election Program, I think, have not really worked. Minor parties have a harder burden and a harder threshold to meet than some of the Democrat and Republican candidates because they're minor parties, and we wrote the rules where we made it more difficult for them. So I think we have to take a look back at it. One of the things I think about when you get involved in politics, people think it's about issues and policies, and it is about that. And sometimes I think we have to look at our policies, and even well-intentioned policies, we have to look at and see are they working for the purpose and the intent that we wanted them to work for. And I think the citizens election is one of those things that we have to. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the citizens of the state of Connecticut, this is not a priority or an issue where they're looking at and seeing how they can do it better. But it might be one of those issues. So I thank you, Rhonda, for that, because I think that's very, very important. The other thing is that what I'm hoping is that I think on a local level, and if you're involved in politics, we have to figure out a way where we increase voter participation and voter turnout. We have to increase those participation percentages. Not only should we have 80% voters in the presidential elections, I believe in primaries, local elections, and state elections, we should be really pushing for 80% at least voter turnout. We do not have that, and we got to figure out a way to do that. Out of all those voters that we have 2.5 million. In the city of Hartford, during the primary, when you have less than 20% of the voters vote, and then they elect the candidates, then you have to wonder and ask yourself, have the people really elected the candidates? And so I think we really have to take a look at that and decide that. Connecticut, as I said, has a lot of progressive laws. How old, let me ask you this, how old do you think you have to be before you can register to vote in Connecticut? I'm going to go to my questions. I'm going to put them on the screen.
Everybody should write that in the chat.
Yeah, then.
That's good, Ken.
Good, can you see it?
Yes, that's looking pretty good.
Okay. So,
Okay, so we have one answer
can-
in the chat.
One says 17, one says 15, one says 18.
can a 17-year-old register to vote in Connecticut? Yes, you can be 17 years old and register to vote in Connecticut.
As long as your
There's a
birthday.
caveat. What's the
There you go.
caveat, Carole?
The caveat is as long as your birthday is
in the
on the day of the election or before.
So if you're 17, for example, somebody that's 17 today, if next week they turn 18, they can actually register to vote today and they'll be able to vote in the primary and the election.
Correct.
Now, I did some voter registration.
Actually, Ken, excuse me. I think that even if, I think they can vote in the primary, even if their birthday's not until, say, November 1, just to pick a date. I think that is allowed, but I'd have to check on that. But
I would check. I would check on that. I
Yeah.
think the actual,
It might only be the regular election day.
Yeah, there was a statute, and I actually had to do some legal research on this. Part of the statute talks about being eligible to vote on the day of election. So if August 9th is the quote day of election and you're not 18, even though you're registered and you'll be 18 in September, you may not be able to, because you have to be eligible to vote on the day of election.
So that's one we'd have to confirm. I'll look up I've got my note for myself. Okay.
Now,
You have another question?
One of the things that I think is that voter empowerment is more than just registering people to vote and say, come out and vote on election day. It's a lot about educating around the issues. It's a lot about how do you hold people accountable. It's about how do you hold policy, how do you develop policies and issues for your community that you want to talk about. Now, let's just go through this very quick. On the top, it was something I did find out, which was very interesting. In this primary that's coming up, some towns ballots are printed in Spanish and English, and some towns in Connecticut are not in Spanish and English, just English only. And it came to my mind, and one of the things that I might ask candidates that's running for statewide office, especially Secretary of State, should the state of Connecticut require that all ballots are printed in Spanish and English? Do we have a population that's large enough that speaks Spanish, and that we need to have that just general policy for the state? So Hartford, New Britain, New Haven, Waterbury has a bilingual ballot. Walcott, Avon, Bloom, Canton do not. Should that be consistent? That's one of the things that little things that you come across and say, wow, why does the big city that have the diverse population have to have it, and they choose to have it because they want to, and I think it's good. But maybe there's something we should say, why don't we just require that for the state? Now, can you now very quickly, we have local governments, which is towns, mayors, and selectmen, city council, town council. They elect and talk about policies on the local level within their town or city. Then you have state representatives and state senators, obviously, based on that name. They're responsible for policies and legislation and laws for all of the citizens of the state of Connecticut. And then we know we have our federal representatives who deal with federal laws, and they work in Washington, D.C. Most times, and if you looked at the news and you look at politics, you hear a lot of discussion in Washington where you'll have the federal legislators talk about, we as a federal government do not want to impose federal laws on our states. Look at the Roe versus Wade, where the Supreme Court made the decision, and now states are making their own policies based on a reaction to that. Whereas before it was a federal law, and we felt that all states had to do that. And so a lot of times the federal legislators will pass things down to the states for the states to determine through their state legislators policies and legislation. So that's why it's very important, in my opinion, that we think about politics as a local action-oriented process versus necessarily a federal process. Federal is important, president's important, representatives are important, but when they give responsibilities back to the states, we on the state level, on the local level, may have a greater impact to affect policy. And that's why we have to be, I think, a lot more aware of our legislation on the state level, and we should be a lot more participating in the things that happen at the Capitol. I don't believe that the state legislature is open to the public. I think they're still doing things on Zoom. I believe they need to stop that and to go back to public hearings and allow people and actually do both and have the hybrid of public hearings by Zoom and in person. Because I do think that one of the things that we may have found out through the Zoom process is a lot of people felt like they could participate more readily. So I don't know if you should get rid of that, but I also think that person to person is very important. I think the state needs to think about that. All right, who can name their mayor or their first select person or for their town? Everybody can do that, right? Everybody knows who their mayors are, right? Everybody? All right.
Yeah.
Can everybody name their state representative?
Yeah.
Okay. Your state senator,
Yes.
because you probably just got a flyer from them, so you should know that
That's
right
true.
now.
That's true.
Right, right. All right. Can anybody tell me one or two basic differences between local elected officials, state and federal in terms of their duties and responsibilities?
That's an interesting question.
Let's just open it up for discussion now. So take yourself off mute and just join in. Can somebody tell me one or two differences?
Well, one difference is that our local, if you're talking about our municipal folks, they have a much smaller area of people to represent. I don't know if that makes a difference. They also are the people that are, in my opinion, most important because they spend more money of your money than your federal level. That's where your money is spent. That's what establishes your community. But this is a good question, Ken. I have not ever thought about this.
I ask people because as a state representative, people might call me sometimes and talk about sanitation services, trash services, and the conditions in their local community, in their parks. And I try to refer them back to the city because there's some responsibilities around trash, around parks, around roads that is a responsibility of the cities. And the state gives them money to do that. So people need to try to figure out what are city responsibilities that you need to call your local officials on. And then there's state responsibilities here in Hartford, Blue Hills Avenue, Albany Avenue. Those are state roads who really the state is responsible for the maintenance of those roads, even though it runs through the city. And so sometimes you'll see somebody will say, well, it's in Hartford, Albany Avenue. Well, but it is a state road, and so you have to have the local government work with the state. State legislation obviously applies to all of the citizens of the state of Connecticut. For example, the Board of Education in the state. But then all of the cities have their own boards of education, and some of their policies may be different than the state policies. They can't be in conflict with the state policies, but they can come up with their own policies. And then the federal government, I believe it or not, is basically oversees how we as a federal government, interstate highways, interstate commerce. And in terms of funding, it is very rare that you will get direct funding from the federal government. Most of the funding from the federal government come through states through different programming. So even when you look at Medicaid, even when you look at education funds, even when you look at some of the COVID funds, they give it to the state and the state decides. So you have very little responsibility from the federal government on budgets of the state. So those are just some of the basic differences.
And there's one question that somebody asked, just to take you back before this closes out. We did start a few minutes late, so maybe we'll go past 8 o'clock, but that's up to Beverly. The question was, how does one find out about the changes in the district? But that was a specific question that was asked. And I know you have some information that you have a site that you can go to.
I'm gonna, in a few minutes, I'm gonna put up the site for the League of Women Voters. I'm gonna highlight that, and I'm gonna put up the site for the Secretary of State. I gotta tell you, Carole, the League of Women Voters site is actually easier formatted and easier to look at and get that information. And so I'll put that up in terms of you'll be able to it talks about the House districts and what they look like now, and it talks about the Senate districts. And you simply just put the district that you're concerned about, the number, and it'll give you a map. And if you blow up that map, it'll give you all the specific streets.
Or
So
the
your site is
right. Good.
Your site is a very good site for that.
Thank you.
And I'll put that up. We know
Hello,
that what percentage of voters voted in the 2020 presidential elections? I told you that earlier. 80%.
79%.
79. Yep. Can unaffiliated voters vote in primaries? No.
Correct.
We know that primaries is basically like a preview, a prelude to the general election. It's in August now. It used to be in September, August, and you can only be of major parties, Democrat, Republicans, to have primaries. Unaffiliates do not have primaries. Some of the minor parties in Connecticut can have primaries. The Green Party, the Independent Party, the Rook and Family parties, because they are recognized parties in Connecticut, but that's very rare. We know Citizens Election Program, public finance. Can somebody name one new law that went into effect in Connecticut this past July?
I'll say the Juneteenth.
Juneteenth, very good.
Good.
Yeah, very good.
And the mental health. They have something about mental health law as well.
So this mental health bill.
What about cannabis?
The cannabis is not new this year. That was actually passed last year. It's being implemented.
Okay.
It's being implemented this year. I think they worked out most of the kinks at this point. Well, we started off obviously a few years ago with the medicinal use of marijuana, so that's been passed. But the recreational use is recent, and implementation is now finally coming into play. The decriminalization and recreational use is a new law, but in terms of the dispensaries, that's what they're working on. Now, here's a question that because I think that when you talk about voter education and voter empowerment, you have to try to think about policies. What are some good policy? What is not what I'm concerned about, not what bothers me, but what are some of the policies and the legislation that we think would be best for our citizens in the state of Connecticut, whether that's around driving, that's around marijuana use, that's around voting, that's around finances and taxes. What are some of the policies? Now, let me ask you this, because I talk to young people sometimes and I have them do a little mock debate, because that's what we do in politics. We debate issues. Let's imagine that somebody had what we call a legislative bill. In the state of Connecticut, you have to propose a bill to talk about how you want to change a law. So the first thing you do is you come up with a bill, you come up with a title, and you say, this is what I think a new law should be. And let's imagine that one of your colleagues, one of your legislative colleagues said, 18 years old should be allowed to purchase and consume alcohol since they are eligible to be inducted into service. And so since we consider them adults at 18, they should be allowed to purchase and consume alcohol. How might you think, if you were a legislator, you would debate that policy?
Well, one thing that
And-
they could start to talk about would be that actually happened in Connecticut some years back. We had 18-year-olds, and the results during the time that was allowed were pretty negative. So they would be going after, different, they'd have to find a way to make that be safe, I suppose. But isn't the science saying that the 18-year-old's brain is not as well developed as adults who are 21 and older? And so that judgment comes into play. That would be part of the argument, I would think. Yeah.
And that would be part of the argument. And so, and this is what happens in state politics specifically, I find, is that people come up with these ideas and they put out a bill, and it could be any bill, and then they have to try to get it through committee, and they'll have a debate on it. And sometimes in committee, you say, this will never pass. You're not going to get support for it. And we call it, and we say it's going to die in committee. It's going to go nowhere. But let's imagine that they muster up enough votes for people to say, well, let's talk about it. Let's have a debate about it. Let's not kill it. And so we put it on what we call the call of the calendar. We say, okay, we'll put it up for debate. And so people will talk about the brain science. People will talk about the safety. And then might have somebody that says, well, look, remember 30 years ago, would you think that we would allow marijuana use to be legal? Would you have thought that?
No.
So,
No.
I would not have thought that. And so somebody and 18-year-olds have used this argument for a long time. Well, if I can go into the service and die for my country, and I'm considered an adult, why can't I do that? Especially when we know 21 to 25-year-olds, because they can drink, have more accidents than people older than them and than people younger than them. Well, younger because they shouldn't be doing it. And the idea is that if younger people are going to drink, and we might believe that they are drinking, wouldn't it be better if they followed the same rules as adults, purchase, driving, whatever, instead of them sneaking it and then not be responsible? So this is the kind of thing that you debate, but these are the kind of things that you hold your elected officials accountable for. And as Beverly said, when you have the debate, come up with some questions around policies that you want to see happen in your community. So if you want to see your community have issues around noise ordinance, you might go to the local community. If you want to have your community talk about funding of the state departments, DCF, Department of Social Services, corrections, and how they service in the community, then you ask the legislators about funding. You ask them about programs. And then you see where they stand at. Where do they stand on children's mental health and funding for social workers? And then how do they make sure that if the community benefit from the children's mental health with families that have younger children that's not in school, with families that have older young adults that's not in school that need that service? And so you develop a set of policies and questions that you want to have your candidates answer. The other thing that you might want to think about is that how do you hold your candidates accountable once they're in office? Should you as community leaders work together like at a forum like this and say every 3 months, we're going to call our legislators together and we're going to check on what their legislation is, how is it going, and how will it benefit me, to benefit our community directly? In the state of Connecticut, you have a lot of what we call commissions. You have and even in your local community, you have the Zoning Board of Appeals, you have the Parks Commission, you have educational assessment commissions, you have the achievement gap commissions, you have wetlands commission, you have a number of volunteer commissions that citizens should be a part of. The state has a lot of those. And a lot of times the names that get referred to those commissions come from your state representatives. So you ask your state representative, if you're interested in a particular issue or particular subject, like the environment, you know, what are the wetlands commission? What's that like? Can I be a part of that? How do I get my name submitted? Because we definitely need more people of color on these commissions. So our legislators need to update us, need to work with us, and we need to hold them accountable. I always believe it's a two-way street. I got elected to represent the people, but I also want the people to hold me accountable, and they have to do that just as well as I have to represent them. This is basically my presentation, Carol. I don't know where people are.
Okay,
There's a
that was
question-
well
there's a
said.
question in the chat. Carol, there's a question in the chat about.
Yes, I just saw that. What are your thoughts on political action committee, PACs, known by some?
I think that I'm going to talk about political action committees, and then I'm going to talk about town committees. Political action committees, I think, are necessary and needed. I think sometimes what I find with political action committees is they're sort of narrowly focused or specific focus, either with an affinity group, an issue group, or whatever. And so they form to raise funds and monies, I think, to promote their ideas. So I think political action committees could be useful to hold political candidates more accountable, especially if those political action committees raises funds, because they can do ads, they can do promotions, they can pay volunteers to do work. And so most of them I find is that they can be helpful for specific issues or specific affinity groups. Now, at the same time, that can work on, I think, a informal basis or a community basis. You have corporations that have political action committees with a lot of funding, and that their funding and their money, I think, can be overly influencing to candidates. I worry about those political action committees because the amount of monies they have and the kind of influences where they're not really checking in with the people. But you know, you got a real estate association, they got a political action committee, they're gonna lobby for issues around real estate and laws and stuff like that. I don't have an issue with that as long as there's full disclosure, transparency, and disclosure and transparency with political action committees, to me, are the main things. Full
And those
disclosure
big ones.
and transparency. Now, just on the side, communities have town committees. Now, people, I don't know if people even know what town committees are, in most towns, elected through the people. There's some towns that have, again, town committees, and the rules on how you get on a town committee range. If you got 169 towns in Connecticut, you probably got 100 different ways that people run their town committees. And how do you get on your town committees? But I do believe that town committees and getting involved locally in your town committee is one way to affect change on the local level, and people should be involved. Now, I think town committees should not be about supporting a specific candidate per se versus making sure that we increase voter participation during voting day, that the issues that that your community is concerned about, that the town committee survey your community and find that out, and that your town committee is the liaison for the people and the candidate. Most town committees are basically used to endorse candidates and have, in my opinion, have little other functions other than endorsing candidates. I think that's a real misuse and underutilization of what town committees should do.
Ken, just a note about that. There's a group in Hartford called Hartford Votes. It has on its website an interview with the Democratic and Republican town committee chairman. So anyone that's interested in getting a little bit of information about how to become part of a town committee or what a town committee does, that is available on that hartfordvotes.org site. So it's interesting that you brought that up. There was a concern for a lot of people.
I have a question. My name is Phyllis Airy. Hello, Ken. I have a question for you. My question is, you mentioned earlier that the state kind of funnel funding down to the city. And in this case, for my question, I wanted to talk about the polling stations after redistricting and how the city ROV, Register of Voter, determines where the polling stations are located. If there's an issue in the community about a polling station location, is there any influence by the Secretary of State on the Register of Voters of our concern? Do you understand my question?
Yeah,
There's some background noise.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any specific law or statute or legislation that can direct the Secretary of State where a local community should put a voting place. I would almost, that's a good question, and I would almost say that the state is silent on that. That the Secretary of State will more than likely defer to the local community and not get involved in that. But that's a very good question. I don't think, for example, if a local community is not pleased with a place of the polling place, I don't think there's an appeal process to go through the Secretary of State.
Yeah,
that's a
and
good
I
question.
find that concerning, since it is so important that every vote counts, that they wouldn't have that exactly what you just said, an appeal option that we can use to bypass the ROV.
You know, and that, Beverly, that's a good question that somebody should pose to the candidates. What do they know about whether or not the Secretary of State can interject in that? Do they think that's appropriate? And if there's no legislation, would they be interested in crafting legislation to talk about it? Because I think it's a good idea. There is a statewide association of registered voters. There's actually a group. It's not as formal as it has been in the past, but they do meet, and it's a statewide coalition of registered voters. So that might be something that, because if there's legislation on that issue, the leadership of the General Assembly, one of the first things they're going to do is ask the Secretary of State to talk to that group of registered voters before they do anything. You try to not just make groups like that just do things without their participation. So that's a good question, and that's something we should probably try to find out.
Thank you.
I will follow up, Ken.
Didn't hear you, Beverly.
Miami. I said I will follow up.
Okay.
Okay.
So,
And I just want to point out one more thing. I'm sorry, Ken. When
Go
you
ahead,
mentioned the town committee, I agree. It's extremely important as a member of the 7th District Assembly Town Committee that we are the liaison between the constituents and the politicians. So it's important that when we do go to get out the vote and ask our constituents to vote accordingly, that we build a relationship and funnel the issues, the accountability of the politician, the information about them, funnel that back, and also learn what the issues are in the community. And we try to do that through organizations like the NAACP, like the West Indian Social Club, the Blue Hill Civic Association, the Mouth organization, which is the Block Watch organization, and the NRZs. We attend those meetings to hear what our community issues are, and also individual door knocking occasionally when we can. But those organizations are extremely important in getting information to the town committee that we could then funnel back and forth between the constituents and the politicians. Thank you.
You know, through forums like this, and Beverly and Claudette, one of the things that I'm doing with the NAACP is I'm trying to come up with five to 10 issues that we want our candidates in the greater Hartford region, on the state level, we want those public officials to develop some policies. And so if you have, and I'm gonna add the registered voters on one of those, but if you have some ideas, we want to do a report card for our state representatives and state senators for the next year. And so we're looking at the issues that we think are important in our community that we want to monitor them on. So if you have any ideas in terms of a policy that you would want our legislators to look at, we want to monitor them. I think the registered voters situation is going to be one. One of the things that I'm real interested in, being a social worker, I'm going to see what the financial impact is going to be with the children's mental health and how some of those funding get to community-based organizations to work with our families in a more creative and non-traditional way than just putting school social workers in school or giving established service agencies more money. I want to know how families and community groups can benefit from the financial impact of that. So that's one of the things I want to monitor, how much money actually comes to our community in non-traditional programs than what they're used to doing.
Sounds good. Carole, I think wrap it up.
I have a question.
Mr. Moses, if
Yes.
if you want to remind Ms. Graham.
My question is, can a voter, any voter, participate in town committee affairs despite their political affiliation?
Yes and no. You could always, yes, you can participate in town committee affairs, whether it's observer, their public meetings, so they can't exclude you from participating. However, in order to be a representative of that town committee of a particular party, you have to be a member of that party. So yes, as an unaffiliated voter, if the Democratic town committee is meeting, I can go, but I have no role. I can, if they allow public comment, I can make comment. But if I want to participate through voting, through endorsements, no, I would have to be a part of that party.
Yeah, I mean, I raised the question because the public needs to know that they can have a voice despite the fact that they're not a Democrat or a Republican. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Moses. And Claudette, That marks the end of the program.
Yes, it does.
Timing. Okay, so we thank Ken very much for his explanation of history, the influence of the redistricting, the influence of our committees, our town committees, and our legislatures, one against the other, and the importance of voting, to get that engagement of everyone to vote and realize that voting isn't just a walk to the booth or filling out an absentee ballot. There is work involved because there's so much information you really need to know in order to be an informed voter. Doesn't take a lot, but if you just regularly follow certain things, you'll be a more effective voter. So Ken, I know you did that very well for us, and I thank you very much. And I thank you, Claudette, and Beverly, for inviting the league to help you with the moderating. Over
Thank
to
you.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you, Carol. You did a wonderful job as a moderator. And Ken, thank you so much. This program was so successful that Ms. Rhonda would like you to take it on the road to New Haven. So we can consider tonight a success.
I'm gonna
Just to-
email her my email.
Oh, you're gonna give her, okay, I'll give her your email. Rhonda, can you
Okay.
put your contact information in the chat, please? So our next topic will be presented on August 18th. The topic will be types of civic engagement. What is civic engagement? Need for civic engagement in the 21st century. Major challenges for civic engagement. And that will be presented on August 18th. Same time, 7 p.m. Via Zoom. We will try to make the flyers a little bit more Zoom friendly. We'll work on that because I've been getting information about people not being able to log on because of the passcode and all that. So it's a work in progress, and we'll try to make it better as we go along. I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight on behalf of the West Indian Social Club, the Women League of Voters, the Blue Hill Civic Association, and the NAACP. We want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to make this event so successful. It was engaging, it was enlightening, and it was great. It's needed, and it was very informative. Again, thank you and good night.
All right, thank you guys for having me.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.